Welcome to the finish line with Sew Very Easy. My name is Laura, and the finish line is all about, well, finishing our quilt tops. And we need to finish our quilts by putting binding on. We can put the binding on traditionally by a domestic sewing machine, but we also can put binding on using free motion. And this is a great thing to do. If you already have your binding made and your quilt is done being quilted, you already have the thread on your machine. We might as well get that binding stitched on. So the first thing we need to do is get our binding done. And it won't matter the size of your binding. If you like to start with 2.5 inches, that's fine. 2 1/4, 2 inches, whatever you like is going to be fine. We do need it pressed and ready to go on. And then the quilt needs to be quilted. But I already have the thread on the machine, my binding's done, so before I trim it up, I can bind my quilt. I will be using the ruler work foot for my quilting machine because I will be using rulers to guide that machine along that straight edge. Now we can use 2 different rulers. We can use a straight edged ruler, or we can use the rulers that do have those little notches cut out of them, because that does equal a 1/4 inch along that foot. You can stop and start your binding any way you would like, but I'll share the method that I like to do. I like my binding cut at 2 1/4 inches. Then I'm going to take that one edge and I'm going to fold it so it's on a 45-degree angle. Press it, and then press it all in half. So I have this little tail. I can now open this up and cut this tail off. I'll be cutting right along this edge, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I don't measure, I just cut with a pair of scissors. So I'm going to cut off that edge and then make sure there's nothing hanging over on that other side. So I have a 45 fold over. I do like to put a little bit of fabric glue, and it's only a temporary glue. That just helps it stay down until I get to it as I go around the quilt. So that's how the end looks. And we're going to start sewing above that end and stitch this on. So you're going to be able to choose an area that you want to start. So I'm going to start on any edge, and I'm going to lay that binding down so that the raw edge matches the raw edge of the quilt. I'm going to start stitching off of that binding, and I'm going to come and stitch on. But this little area, I want to do a little less than a 1/4 inch. So I'm going to go right onto the edge of the quilt and lower that needle. And just pull those threads out of the way. Make sure those edges are together. And then we can use these great rulers that have those notches put out. The notches are going to fit right along that raw edge. I'm going to hold that ruler down, and that's going to help me not have to pin that. And stitch, just following the edge of the ruler. Once I get past that fold, I'm going to be able to line up the 1/4 inch. I'm going to raise that needle and that foot just a little bit so that I can adjust it. I'm going to have that flat edge right along that seam allowance. So I have my 2 layers of my binding and my quilt front. I'm making sure that that backing is all out of the way so I'm not stitching it in. And I can now just stitch holding this ruler. Start with that needle down and move. I now have that perfect 1/4 inch. If we're going to use this edge of the ruler that's notched out and take advantage of that 1/4 inch, it needs to come to the outside. So this flat edge will run along that selvage, and that's going to give us that 1/4 inch measurement. If we're going to use it to the inside, in order to get that 1/4 inch, we will need to use a mark on the ruler. If this comes right to the edge, we're going to be stitching right along this raw edge, and we need a 1/4 inch in. This measurement is a 1/4 inch, but it's coming from this edge. So from this edge, we need a 1/2 inch. If you have a ruler with a mark, you can do that, or you can even mark it yourself. Then once all those layers are done, we can just hold this and travel with the machine. If you don't have a ruler with one of these ends on them, you can use a straight edge quilting ruler. This is still that thick ruler, but it doesn't have one of those little ends. Find the measurement that matches your binding, and it's really easy if you just leave that foot down at that 1/4 inch, and then you can see what your measurement is going to be. So I can adjust this, make sure that folded edge is along my measurement on my ruler. Hold that ruler down and stitch. And of course, you can always use it right on this edge, which means you'd not need a measurement at all. You're just going to use the edge of this fabric. And we want to stitch and stop a 1/4 inch to the end of this quilt. When I'm a 1/4 inch to the end, I'm going to just stitch off on an angle going towards my stitching. Give yourself some room to work and do that traditional fold. So this edge of the fabric, which will be a fold, matches that top. So I have that fold. Use whatever ruler you're comfortable with. Straighten up those edges. And in this case, I'm going to use the measuring ruler. It's lined up. This is a 1/2 inch. With that foot, it's going to give me a 1/4 inch. And I'm just going to stitch right back to that area and gently go over that curve. So now I can continue stitching my 1/4 inch seam. Now we can always take the quilt and move it so that it's facing more in a traditional way, or you can do it sideways. If you find you're having problems keeping this row straight, we can use 2 rulers. Use that one ruler with the little ends, so that edge is going right along that edge of the fabric. Place a second ruler on top. So the one ruler is holding the binding down. The other ruler you're following as a guide. So you're going to be able to push this in and have equal pressure. So that foot is really going through a channel. Stop. Line up the edge. Line up that one ruler. Put the second on. Hold both down and stitch. I like using 2 rulers just because it gives me something to hold on to, so both the fabric is going at the same speed. I'm using the one as a guide and the other one to hold down that binding. Once we've gone all the way around and we've come to the beginning, we only have that tiny little seam just holding this flap down, and then it skips over to that 1/4 inch. We will need to take this top piece and we're going to put it inside. So this piece needs to have an angle cut. So that angle needs to be cut somewhere in this area. If it comes too far here, it won't tuck inside, and we do want to keep it within that seam allowance. I like to use a little bit of glue and just run it inside a little bit. And then take that and stick it in between those 2 layers. Smooth it with your hand so both of those layers come together. Match up that top edge, and that glue is going to help hold that down for us. Now continue stitching that 1/4 inch until you come to this point and go a little bit past. So I'm going right over my first stitching, and I'm going to join up to my second line, and then we can come off onto the batting. So this is how the beginning and the end is going to look into the inside. When we turn it to the right side, we have a nice 45-degree angle. We can hand stitch that down as we're hand stitching the binding down. But that glue is just going to hold it for us until we get to that stage. This is definitely a different way to bind your quilts. A lot of us will trim off our batting and square up our quilt first and then put the binding on. But if your quilt is already straight and you know you're not going to do any trimming, you can trim this off after and put that binding on first. We can now trim off all of this batting. You can use a rotary cutter or you can use scissors. Just trim along that edge. But when it comes to this fold, be sure to move that fold out of the way. If you cut the fold, you will have a hole and you do not want to restitch. So just fold that top out of the way. And trim. The first time we sew this binding on using a free motion foot and the rulers, it's going to seem very strange because traditionally we've always trimmed this off and then sat at a domestic machine and stitched the binding on. But this is definitely one other way of putting the binding on. Since we already have the machine set up, the thread is already there, and it's done. You can trim your quilt first and then put the binding on, and you'll just be able to use a ruler that's going to sit on top of that fabric. So you're going to have to just be sure that you have that 1/2 inch space, so the 1/4 inch foot will fit inside that 1/2 inch. And that way you will end up with that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Give it a try next time and find which method works for you. 2 rulers, 1 ruler, left, right, up, down. Well, the best way to do it is the way that you're comfortable doing it. And thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe, and as always, come on back. Let's see what we're going to talk about next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.